He pinned her against the sticky bar, flashing a smirk that screamed he was used to getting his way. To him, she was just another fragile civilian. He had no idea the woman he just cornered had 3 confirmed kills from 2,000 yards out. He picked the wrong prey. The rain outside of Camp Lejeune was relentless, turning the cracked asphalt of Jacksonville, North Carolina, into a slick, black mirror, inside O'Malley's pub. The air was thick with the scent of stale Coors Light, floor wax, and cheap cologne. It was a Saturday night, and the bar was packed with loud, young Marines blowing their paychecks, looking for a fight, a drink, or a girl, usually in that order. Lieutenant Echo Jenkins sat at a corner stool, nursing a lukewarm beer she had no intention of drinking, dressed in faded Levi's, scuffed Converse, and an oversized grey zip-up hoodie. She looked like a tired local waitress who had just finished a double shift at the Waffle House down the road. She slouched, her shoulders rounded, making her naturally athletic, 5'9" frame appear smaller, softer, and entirely unremarkable. That was exactly the point. Echo wasn't a waitress. She was a Tier 1 operator. Specifically, she was a sniper attached to Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6. Her presence here was highly classified, part of a joint JSOC and ATF task force designed to plug a massive, bleeding hole in the Department of Defense's logistics network. Over the past 3 months, high-end military hardware specifically. PEQ-15 infrared lasers, encrypted Harris radios, and crates of M85 5A1 armor-piercing rounds had been quietly walking out of the armories on base. The gear wasn't being sold to local street gangs. It was being funneled to a highly organized domestic syndicate with international buyer connections. Through the smoky haze of the bar, Echo's eyes trained to spot the twitch of a curtain from a mile away. Through a Schmidt and Bender, 5 to 25 times 56 scope were locked onto a man in a leather jacket sitting in the back booth. His name was Thomas Gallagher. He was the local fence, the middleman who moved the stolen gear from the corrupt insiders on base to the buyers waiting in the shadows. Echo's objective was simple: observe Gallagher, wait for his contact to show up, and track the merchandise back to the stash house. She was a ghost, invisible, until the predator decided she was his next meal. "You look like you're drinking that beer out of obligation, sweetheart." The voice was loud, booming over the sound of Eric Church playing on the digital jukebox. Echo didn't flinch, but her peripheral vision instantly mapped the threat. He was a Marine, early 20s, tall, maybe 6'2", weighing roughly 210 pounds. He wore a tight grunt-style t-shirt that showed off heavy, gym-built biceps adorned with fresh tribal tattoos. A set of silver dog tags jingled outside his shirt, a rookie move, screaming for attention. "I'm fine, thanks," Echo said, keeping her voice soft, pitching it slightly higher than her natural tone. She didn't look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the condensation dripping down her pint glass, while carefully tracking Gallagher's booth in the mirror behind the bar. "I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you look miserable." The Marine chuckled, sliding onto the empty stool right next to her. He invaded her personal space immediately, bringing with him the sharp scent of Jack Daniels and Drakkar Noir. "I'm Brody, Corporal Brody Mitchell. What's a girl like you doing sitting all alone in a place like this, waiting for my boyfriend?" Echo lied smoothly, a standard deflection tactic. Brody scoffed, leaning his heavy forearm on the bar, effectively pinning her in the corner. If your boyfriend leaves a girl who looks like you alone in a bar full of Marines, he ain't much of a man. Let me buy you a real drink. Bartender, 2 shots of patron. Echo's resting heart rate sat at a cool 50 beats per minute. In her head, she was already calculating Brody's center of gravity, noting the slight imbalance in his stance from the alcohol. A swift palm strike to the base of his nose or a targeted kick to the peroneal nerve in his leg would drop him in less than 2 seconds. But she couldn't afford a scene. If the police were called, her cover would be blown. Gallagher would spook, and weeks of deep cover reconnaissance would vanish into thin air. I really don't want a shot. Brody, I'm just leaving, Echo said, making a move to grab her cheap faux leather purse from the bar. Before her fingers could touch the strap, Brody's large hand clamped down over hers. His grip was tight, bordering on painful. The playful, cocky demeanor vanished in a millisecond, replaced by a dark, aggressive entitlement. I said, I'm buying you a drink, Brody growled, his voice dropping an octave. You locals think you can just come in here, drink up our atmosphere, and disrespect the guys defending your freedom. You're going to take the shot, darling. Echo slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. For a split second, the facade of the frightened waitress slipped. The eyes looking back at Brody weren't soft or intimidated. They were cold, flat, and entirely dead inside the eyes of a woman who had spent weeks lying in the freezing mud of the Hindu Kush, controlling her breathing while waiting for a high-value target to step into her crosshairs. Brody blinked, physically taking a half step back, suddenly unnerved by the chilling void in her stare. He didn't understand what he was looking at, but some primal instinct deep inside his brain flashed a bright red warning sign. Danger. But Brody was drunk, and he had an ego to maintain. 2 of his buddies, a stocky guy with a buzz cut and a taller, lanky kid, had noticed the interaction and were sauntering over. Everything good here? Brody, the stocky one, asked, eyeing Echo up and down like a piece of meat. Yeah, just trying to teach this townie some manners. Brody sneered, his confidence returning with his back up. He leaned in closer, his hot breath brushing Echo's ear. You're gonna sit down, drink the tequila, and give me your number, or me and my boys are gonna make sure you have a really, really bad night. Echo let out a slow, measured breath. The situation had officially transitioned from a nuisance to a tactical problem. She glanced at the mirror behind the bar. Gallagher was still in his booth, but he wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He was staring directly at the altercation, and that's when Echo noticed the detail that changed everything. Brody's hand, the one still resting near her purse, had a highly specific, crude tattoo of a black spiderweb on the webbing of his thumb. It was a gang identifier, but not a street gang. It was the mark of the Iron Web, the exact smuggling ring Echo was hunting. Brody wasn't a random, drunk Marine hitting on a girl. He was Gallagher's muscle. The entire harassment act was a calculated pressure test. They had noticed her sitting alone, nursing 1 beer for 3 hours, observing the room. They were flushing her out. The hunt hadn't just begun. She had just become the prey. The realization washed over Echo with ice-cold clarity. The loud music, the cheering from the pool tables, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into a dull background hum. Her world narrowed down to the 3 men boxing her in, and the man in the leather jacket watching from 30 feet away. I'll say it one last time, Brody whispered roughly, his grip tightening on her forearm. Who are you waiting for? Sweetheart, because it ain't a boyfriend. You've been staring at the boss's table since you walked in. The stocky Marine stepped to Echo's left, blocking her path to the front door. The lanky kid shifted his weight to his right foot, blocking her access to the bathrooms. It was a textbook envelopment tactic. They were trying to herd her toward the back exit, an alleyway where cameras didn't reach, and the rain would wash away any evidence of a struggle. "I don't know what you're talking about," Echo stammered, deliberately letting her voice tremble. She let her eyes widen in feigned panic. "Please, just let me go. I'll leave." She needed them to make the first move. Under the heavy fabric of her hoodie, resting snugly against the small of her back in a Kydex holster, was a Glock 19. It was loaded with hollow points. But drawing a firearm in a crowded bar full of active-duty military was a guaranteed bloodbath. She had to handle this with her hands. "You ain't going anywhere," the stocky Marine growled, reaching out to grab her other shoulder. The second his fingers brushed the fabric of her hoodie, Echo exploded into motion. The transition from a terrified civilian to a lethal Tier 1 operator was instantaneous. She didn't pull her arm away from Brody's grip. Instead, she stepped into him, using his own force against him. With blinding speed, her left hand shot up, the rigid blade of her palm crashing violently into the brachial plexus nerve cluster on the side of Brody's neck. Brody didn't even have time to grunt. His eyes rolled back into his skull as his brain short-circuited. His legs turned to jelly, and the 210-pound Marine dropped like a sack of wet cement, his head bouncing off the brass footrail of the bar. The stocky Marine stared in shock for a fraction of a second, a fatal delay. Echo pivoted sharply on the ball of her foot. She grabbed the back of the stocky Marine's thick neck, yanked him aggressively forward, and drove her right knee upward with bone-shattering force. The wet crunch of cartilage echoed over the music as her knee collided with his nose. Blood sprayed across the sticky bar top in a brilliant crimson arc. He collapsed backward, taking 2 bar stools down with him in a clattering crash. The bar erupted into chaos. Women screamed. Drunk patrons scrambled backward, beers shattering on the floor. The third man, the lanky kid, panicked. Instead of attacking, he reached for his waistband. Gun! Echo's combat arithmetic processed the threat in a microsecond. She couldn't let him draw. She closed the distance before he could even clear the fabric of his shirt. She trapped his right wrist against his body with her left hand, simultaneously driving the heel of her right hand into his throat, just hard enough to collapse the windpipe slightly without crushing it. As he choked and gagged, dropping to his knees, Echo smoothly disarmed him, pulling a compact Sig Sauer P365 from his belt and tossing it behind the bar. Total elapsed time, 4.2 seconds. 3 trained, active-duty Marines were groaning or unconscious on the floor. The terrifying efficiency of the violence left the surrounding patrons frozen in absolute shock. Echo didn't look at the men she had just dismantled. Her eyes snapped immediately to the back booth. Thomas Gallagher was gone. "Damn it!" she hissed under her breath. She vaulted over the writhing body of the stocky Marine and sprinted toward the back of the bar. A bouncer tried to step in her way, his hands raised. Without breaking her stride, Echo lowered her shoulder and drove right through his center of mass, sending the massive man tumbling into a pinball machine. She hit the heavy steel door of the rear exit, slamming the push bar with both hands. The door flew open, and she burst out into the freezing, torrential rain of the alleyway. The smell of wet garbage and diesel exhaust hit her instantly. The alley was pitch black, illuminated only by the intermittent red flash of a neon sign from the street. Water poured off the roof of the building in sheets, blinding her. She drew her Glock 19 from her lower back, her thumb intuitively sweeping the safety off. She snapped the weapon up to a compressed high-ready position, her eyes scanning the shadows. Tires squealed at the far end of the alley. Through the heavy curtain of rain, she saw the tail lights of a black Ford F-15, fishtailing onto the main road. Gallagher was making his escape. Echo broke into a dead sprint. Her boots splashed violently through deep puddles, her muscles burning as she pushed her body to its absolute limit. She reached the end of the alley just in time to see the F-150 run a red light, swerving around a slow-moving sedan before disappearing onto Highway 17. She lowered her weapon, the rain plastering her hair to her face, her chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through her veins. The mission was blown. Gallagher knew he was being watched. The Iron Web smuggling ring would go to ground, and the stolen military hardware would disappear forever. Suddenly, the encrypted comms earpiece hidden deep in her right ear crackled to life with a burst of static. "Wraith, this is Overwatch." A deep, calm voice transmitted over the secure JSOC channel. "We caught the show on the interior cameras. You made quite a mess." "The target is rabbiting," Echo replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Black Ford, F-15, heading south on 17. Send QRF to intercept." "Negative." "Wraith," Overwatch replied. "We're letting him run. Gallagher wasn't the actual target tonight. He was the bait." Echo's brow furrowed, the rain stinging her eyes. "Repeat. Overwatch. What do you mean he was the bait?" "Intel updated 5 minutes ago. The man you just put to sleep on the barroom floor. Corporal Mitchell. He's not Gallagher's muscle. Mitchell is the mastermind behind the armory thefts. Gallagher works for him." Echo slowly turned her head, looking back down the dark, rain-swept alley toward the rear door of the bar. The loud, arrogant, obnoxious Marine who had just tried to buy her a drink wasn't a low-level thug. He was the kingpin she had been hunting for 3 months, and she had just left him unconscious on the floor of a dive bar surrounded by 100 witnesses. "Copy that. Overwatch," Echo said, racking the slide of her Glock to chamber a round. She holstered the weapon and began walking back toward the bar, her boots crunching on the wet gravel. "I'm going back inside for the package." But as Echo reached the heavy steel door and pulled it open, the interior of the bar wasn't filled with the sounds of chaos and police sirens. It was dead silent. She stepped through the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The patrons were backed against the walls, their hands raised in the air, eyes wide with terror. Standing in the center of the room was Corporal Brody Mitchell. He wasn't unconscious anymore. Blood was pouring from the side of his head, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. And in his hands, leveled directly at the chest of a terrified bartender, was a stolen military-issue M4 carbine. Mitchell locked eyes with Echo as she stepped into the room. A wicked, blood-stained smile spread across his face. "You hit pretty hard for a waitress," Mitchell spat, clicking the selector switch on the rifle from semi-auto to full auto. "Now, let's see how you do against 556. The air in O'Malley's pub had turned to lead. The erratic flashing of the neon Budweiser signs cast harsh, jagged shadows across the terrified faces of the patrons pinned against the walls. The heavy scent of spilled alcohol and copper blood was completely overpowered by the unmistakable, metallic tang of an impending firefight. Lieutenant Echo Jenkins stood perfectly still just inside the rear exit. Her Glock 19 was still holstered at her lower back, her empty hands resting neutrally at her sides. Her eyes, however, were locked onto the muzzle of the stolen M4 carbine in Corporal Brody Mitchell's hands. A standard 5.56mm NATO round travels at roughly 3,000 feet per second. At this distance, barely 20 feet, it would tear through the bartender's chest, punch cleanly through the heavy oak of the bar, and likely strike one of the civilians cowering in the booths behind it. Brody had the selector switch flipped all the way back, full auto. A single twitch of his finger would spray 30 armor-piercing rounds across the room in 3 seconds. It would be a slaughter. "Put the rifle down, Brody," Echo said. Her voice was no longer the soft, trembling tone of a frightened waitress. It was the calm, resonant, and unnervingly steady voice of a Tier 1 commander controlling a volatile battle space. "You pull that trigger, and there is no coming back. Right now, it's assault and theft of government property. You start shooting civilians, it's domestic terrorism. You'll never see the outside of Leavenworth." Brody laughed, a wet, ragged sound. Blood from his shattered nose was dripping down his chin, staining the collar of his grunt-style shirt. He pressed the hot muzzle of the rifle harder into the chest of the elderly bartender, a man named Jimmy, who was silently weeping. "You think I care about Leavenworth, sweetheart?" Brody spat, wiping a smear of blood from his mouth with the back of his tattooed hand. "You feds are all the same. You think you can just walk into my town, sit in my bar, and dismantle my operation. You really thought I didn't know who you were." Echo's heart skipped a single, imperceptible beat. "I don't know what you're talking about," Echo replied, keeping her posture relaxed, betraying zero emotion. "I'm just a local girl who wanted a drink." "Cut the crap, Lieutenant Jenkins," Brody snarled, his eyes wide with a manic, adrenaline-fueled intensity. Hearing her real name and rank hit Echo like a physical blow. Her cover wasn't just blown, it had never existed. Only a handful of people in the entire Joint Special Operations Command knew she was on this deployment. Female operators attached to SEAL Team 6 were a closely guarded secret. Ghosts within a machine of ghosts. The Iron Web smuggling ring was a sophisticated domestic syndicate, but they didn't have the cyber capabilities to hack JSOC's classified databases. There was only one way Brody Mitchell knew her name. "You have a leak," Brody grinned, reading the micro-expressions on her face. "A massive, bleeding leak right in your own command center. You thought you were hunting me tonight. Echo, I drew you out. We knew you were coming to O'Malley's. I played the drunk, aggressive Marine just to see what you were made of. And I got to admit, that strike to my neck flawless. But you're still going to die in this dive bar." In Echo's right ear, the secure comms unit crackled. "Wraith, this is Overwatch," Captain Richard Hayes's voice transmitted. "We are seeing the hostage situation on the feeds. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. QRF is 3 minutes out. Hold your position." Echo didn't move her lips, sub-vocalizing her response so Brody couldn't hear. "Overwatch. The target knows my name and rank. How does he know my identity? Captain Hayes." There was a long, agonizing pause of static on the comms. "I don't know. Wraith," Hayes finally replied, but Echo heard it, the slight hesitation, the microscopic shift in his vocal cadence. He was lying. "Tell Captain Hayes I said hello," Brody mocked, his finger tightening on the trigger of the M4. The pieces violently slammed into place in Echo's mind. Captain Hayes, her handler, the man sitting in the armored command vehicle 3 miles away, was the mole. He was the one facilitating the movement of the stolen military hardware out of Camp Lejeune. Hayes had the access to alter inventory logs, bypass armory security protocols, and most importantly, monitor the federal task force hunting the thieves. When Echo got too close to uncovering the truth, Hayes hadn't called the mission off. He had sent her directly into a trap to be executed by Brody, planning to write it off as a tragic undercover-op gone wrong. Echo calmly reached up to her right ear, pulled the high-tech earpiece out, dropped it onto the wet floorboards, and crushed it under the heel of her Converse sneaker. She was entirely on her own. No backup, no extraction, just a ghost locked in a cage with a monster. So, here is how this plays out, Brody announced to the terrified room. I'm going to put a 3-round burst into the lieutenant's chest. Then, me and my boys are going to clear out the basement and vanish. If anyone breathes a word of this to the local cops, the iron web will find you, and we will burn your houses down with your families inside. Do we understand each other? The civilians whimpered in collective terror. Echo's eyes darted around the room. She needed a distraction, a lethal one. Her gaze flicked to the ceiling above the bar. Running directly over Brody's head was a thick, exposed PVC pipe, the main line for the bar's commercial fire suppression system, heavily pressurized with chemical foam. Brody, Echo said, her voice cutting through the ambient panic. You're forgetting one crucial tactical variable. Oh yeah, what's that? Brody mocked, shifting his weight. I didn't miss. Echo didn't reach for the Glock at her lower back. It was too slow. Instead, her hand flashed to the deep pocket of her oversized hoodie. In a blur of motion, she drew the compact Sig Sauer P365 she had stripped from the lanky Marine earlier. She didn't aim at Brody. She aimed straight up. Crack, crack. 2 9mm rounds shattered the high-pressure PVC pipe directly above the bar. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. A deafening mechanical hiss erupted as highly pressurized, thick white chemical fire retardant foam exploded downward like a localized blizzard. It slammed into Brody and the bartender, instantly blinding them and filling the air with a choking, thick fog. Brody screamed in surprise, instinctively stepping backward and squeezing the trigger of the M4. The rifle roared, spitting a torrent of hypervelocity, 5.56mm rounds blindly into the ceiling and the back wall, shattering a massive mirror behind the bar into a million glittering razor blades. Glass and splinters rained down on the room. The deafening concussion of the rifle fire indoors shattered eardrums, throwing the bar into absolute pandemonium. But Echo was already gone. The moment her finger broke the trigger on the Sig Sauer, she dropped low, sliding across the beer-soaked hardwood floor, diving entirely under the physical cover of the heavy oak bar. She moved with the fluid, silent grace of a predator, crawling rapidly through the darkness behind the counter, navigating by memory. Above her, Brody was coughing violently, blinded by the chemical foam, firing short, panicked bursts into the empty space where Echo had just been standing. "Where is she?" Brody roared to his recovering men. "Find her, shoot her." Echo holstered the empty Sig Sauer and smoothly drew her Glock 19. She was now in her element. The lights were mostly shattered. The air was thick with chemical smoke, and the enemy was panicked. They were fighting a girl in a bar. She was fighting a war. The bar dissolved into chaos as thick foam poured from the ceiling, swallowing the room in blinding white. Emergency lights flickered, casting everything in a dim, blood-red haze, hidden behind the ice machine. Echo slowed her breathing, letting the noise guide her. Civilians had already fled, only hunters remained. Bootsteps echoed through broken glass. One moved toward the kitchen, another toward the pool tables. Brody held the center, controlling the exit. Echo moved first. She slipped through the fog, silent as a shadow, and reached the kitchen just as the younger Marine pushed the door open. In a single motion, she struck hand over mouth, leg sweeping him down, then the solid impact of her weapon against his skull. He dropped without a sound. One down. A crash followed metal against kegs, drawing the second Marine's fire. Gunshots ripped through the haze, wild and blind. Brody turned, trying to track the chaos, but visibility was gone. Echo used it. She circled wide, re-entering from the rear hallway. Through a break in the fog, she saw her target. 2 suppressed shots. The Marine dropped instantly, weapon clattering away. Brody reacted fast, spraying rounds into the hallway. Bullets tore through drywall, snapping inches above her as she hit the floor. Then silence. His rifle was empty. Echo surged forward. Before he could reload, she slammed into him with full force, driving him backward through a door and down into the basement. She followed. At the bottom, her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing not just Brody, broken and bleeding, but rows of stolen military crates, weapons, explosives, evidence, the truth. When Brody realized, it was already over. Floodlights blasted through the windows. Boots thundered above. She had never been the prey. She had been the trap. Did this intense, deep-cover military operation keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved the tactical twists and Echo's unstoppable skills, hit that like button right now. Share this story with your friends who love high-stakes action. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life military drama and undercover operations. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a mission,